And the Immigration Minister Chris Bowen joins me in the studio now. Chris Bowen, welcome.
Good morning, John.
Now, first of all, they were traumatic scenes in Sydney yesterday for these burials. Why did you agree to have these burials in Sydney rather than on Christmas Island?
Because that was the request of the next of kin. And the alternative here, Joe, was to say, well, we will bury people at Christmas Island in the full knowledge that you will not be able to visit the grave, because once you leave Christmas Island, you are very unlikely to go back to it as a detainee. So we consulted, and the Federal Police consulted with the families, and in those instances where families said we've got relatives in Sydney who can look after the grave, tend the grave, and that's where we would settle if we get to stay in Australia, we agreed to that request. I think that's appropriate. The alternative is to say we insist that we'll bury people at Christmas Island, or you can bury people in Sydney, but we're not going to let you come to the funeral of your son or your father. I wasn't prepared to do that.
What do you make of the opposition in questioning the government's decision on this and making taxpayers pay for this?
Well, look, I think they need to reflect on that. I don't want to get into a political slanging match with the opposition about funerals. I think it's unfortunate that that gets politicised. I think it's appropriate that we recognise that these are difficult circumstances, unique circumstances, and we've got the balance right. There are going to be people, and there have been people who've criticised me for being too tough and not being more generous in relation to the funeral. There's others who criticise me for not being tough enough. I think we got the balance right.
So the opposition is going to push for the government to reveal the cost to taxpayers in estimates next week?
Well, happy to do that, of course. And look, there are costs associated with this. A charter from Christmas Island, which is the only way to do it, it's a long way from the mainland, will cost for this number of people about $300,000. I recognise that that's a significant amount of money. But as I say, the alternative is to be quite harsh with people and say we won't let you attend the funeral of your loved ones, or we insist on holding the funeral somewhere where you will not be able to keep in contact with somebody who's been very close to you. And I don't think that's something which at the end of the day would be fair or sustainable.
The government has spoken of compassion in terms of agreeing to some of the requests in relation to these funerals. But what of the 9-year-old orphaned in the accident still in detention on Christmas Island? He's being flown straight back to detention as we understand it today. Where's the compassion there?
He will be released into the community. I've said that I'll release the majority of children and families into the community by June, and I'm prioritising people who've been through trauma and torture, and he will be prioritised.
So it's February now. Will he have to wait until June?
No. We're well advanced in our processing of that, but we've had to consider psychological reports, where he should be placed, what's in his best interests, etc. It's not as simple as saying, we're going to drop him off in Sydney. There's a process to go through, and we've released about 100 children into the community since that announcement on October 18 that we're going to move that, and we've been developing with churches and charities, Red Cross, the appropriate accommodation for people, and that takes a little bit of time, and we're on target by June to have the majority into the community, and we will see more, including the tragic cases, moved into the community in the not too distant future.
Have you got any idea in relation to this particular boy with these horrible circumstances?
Quite soon.
Within a month?
Quite soon, and every one of those circumstances is difficult, Joe, as you'd understand. These are the terrible cases we've seen on television last night, but every child who is in detention or who's come to Australia in this circumstance has been through a lot, and we are moving them into the community. That's the appropriate thing to do, but we do so with the appropriate care, the appropriate support, the appropriate accommodation.
In the media we've seen that he's with his auntie's family at the moment. Can you reveal, I don't know how much you can reveal about individuals' cases, but is it the case that he will move with his auntie to Sydney?
Well, the normal circumstance would be that he would be cared for by an appropriate church, charity, psychologically trained carer, etc. I'll look at all the options in relation to each particular case, and I'm not in a position yet to go into the details about what will happen with him. Just underline some of the complexities we deal with some of these cases.
Just one of the other cases that arose out of these funerals yesterday that's been covered in the media, and the question of compassion rises again. This is Madian El Ibrahimi was flown to Sydney yesterday. He's to bury his daughter. He lost his wife in the Christmas Island boat tragedy as well. He's been in detention since April. He's got a brother in Sydney. He wants to be in Sydney, but he's being flown back today. Where's the compassion in that case?
Well, again, separate to the funerals, we don't have a program to move people en masse out of detention if they're not children or members of families, but we do have a case-by-case basis, and I do, where there's particular circumstances, particular trauma, move people into the community on a case-by-case basis. And of course, we also move people closer to the mainland in particular circumstances. And again, he'd be considered as part of that process. I wouldn't rule out moving him to Sydney, but there's a process that we go through. But it's quite separate to the funeral, so I don't think we can put the two issues together and say because he's in Sydney for a funeral, he should automatically be transferred to Sydney today.
But you can understand.
I certainly do, and these are difficult cases, and there are many difficult cases that we deal with, and people have been through a lot, and I certainly take as compassionate approach as I can in considering these cases.
So can you reveal in his situation if it's likely that he is going to be allowed to return to Sydney in the near future?
Look, I'm not yet in a position, but I'll certainly be looking at it and have been looking at it as compassionately as I can. In relation to families and children, yes, unless there's very good reasons why they shouldn't be moving into the community, then we are moving into the community. In relation to single adult men, there's not that automatic approach, but there is a case-by-case approach, and we do release people into appropriate community care where the circumstances would suggest that's the right thing to do, and he'll be considered as part of that process.
Now, just finally, we've seen the Prime Minister Julia Gillard there at the New Zealand Parliament this morning. She'll be holding talks with John Key over the next couple of days. Will the Regional Processing Centre be coming up in those talks?
Certainly I'd expect the two Prime Ministers to be talking about their approach to the Bali meeting, which is coming up, and the regional processing frameworks, yes.
Where does that all stand now, and how confident are you of that going ahead? Because we've had some pretty mixed reactions around the region to that. Well,
this is a controversial proposal, of course, and of course governments are right to consider it closely and to talk to us about the various elements to a regional framework. We have the Bali meeting coming up at the end of March, which is where the foreign and immigration ministers through the Bali process would discuss this and would reach some consensus as to the way forward for developing the regional framework.
So you're still positive that it will actually happen?
Well, I still think that you need a regional and international solution to a regional and international problem, and I still think that's where we must be focused, and we are focused. And I must say, whenever I talk to one of my colleague immigration ministers around the region, they agree that a regional framework, a regional approach, is something that we must be seriously developing.
Okay, Chris Bowen, thanks for coming in.
Nice talking to you, Joe.